Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Misshappycatholic and this is my guest Tony. We've had Tony on before, but we get to have him again. Hi Tony, how are you doing?
I am just fine. How about yourself?
Oh, we're good. Good.
I know how everyone missed me. Everyone loved me last time, so.
Well, I liked it, and I did get some good feedback, and there was just so much good stuff in there. So we're back again because Tony has now added a fourth paper to his series on Contra Lefebvrism, and this one is part 4 on the Mass, and it kind of covers the document Sacrosanctum Concilium from Vatican II, as well as the new Roman Missal and the Ottaviani Intervention, sort of answering the points that made and sort of debunking that. So there's a lot of really good stuff. Hopefully we can get through it in one session. We'll see. But yeah, I read the paper. It's loaded. Here it is. I will be referencing it while Tony goes through. But yeah, let's just kind of dive in. And Tony, was this the hardest paper to compile? I think it's your longest one so far.
Yes, it really was.
There were a lot of footnotes. I was like, wow, look at him go.
Yeah, I mean, like, I hesitate to call it the Ottaviani Intervention because all he really did was supply the cover letter proposing this as like, hey, there were concerns presented and I think they're worth a look. And then later on he retracted the view on the new Mass because after the clarifications from Pope St. Paul VI, he said that, and I quote, "No one can any longer be genuinely scandalized." And he also went on to say, "I regret only that my name has been misused in a way I do not wish by publishing a letter that I wrote to the Holy Father without authorizing anyone to publish it." So basically, anyone still calling this the Ottaviani Intervention is still misusing his name, and I think we should honor the good Cardinal's memory by no longer calling it the Ottaviani Intervention. But that is just my opinion.
Ooh, that's a really good point. I mean, there's that book out there that's titled The Ottaviani Intervention, so that's kind of what's bandied about and how people think of it, because I think of the book and printing it on his name primarily, even though he really didn't support it as emphatically as others, and then eventually abandoned it, like you said. So what would your suggestion be for an alternative title?
How about the Father Gerard de Laurier Intervention?
Oh, there you go. All right.
It was supposedly written by 12 theologians, but I have done the exhaustive amount of looking into who wrote this, and that was the only name that I found attributed to it.
Interesting.
The only one. I don't know who the other 11 are, and if anyone can tell me who they are, I would love to hear it, because I would love to have more than just Father Gerard de Laurier, and I hope I got his name right. I don't speak French. And I don't really know if he's really the best resource for the society anyway, because he left the society and adopted the seed privationist theory. I don't know if he went full sedevacantist sitting here, but he was no longer associated with the society later on. So right. I don't know if they still want to use his work. So that's kind of my preface for the Ottaviani Intervention, or the de Laurier Intervention. I'll just call it de Laurier.
I think that's a good point. Really good point. And this is a very common, the Ottaviani Intervention book is very common to run into in trad circles, right? You said it was one of the first books you read after encountering the society. Didn't someone from the society kind of give it to you to be like, oh, here, read this so you understand our position?
Yes, the prior at the local society church helpfully gave me a copy, and it was one of the printer papered ones, so I had the ability to write notes on it. So I gave it like 3 or 4 different reads. Not exactly the most stirring takedown of the new Missal, as you might think. It's one of those things where the more you read it, the more problems you see with it in terms of the way it's structured, the way it makes its arguments, the way it just presents itself, starting from its use of an earlier edition of the general instruction of the Roman Missal, because the general instruction of the Roman Missal has changed many times since this was written. So for traditionalists to continue to rely on this one, it's
right.
I don't know if they really realize that much of the information that this study relies on is outdated, because it doesn't even rely on the final missal that ended up coming out. It relied on the new normative missal that was put before the concilium.
So basically a draft missal.
Yeah. Or rather a draft instruction on how to celebrate it and the definitions and stuff. And that was the instruction that this study was objecting to. So obviously a lot of those things were taken into account, because when the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, then the CDF, replied back on it after reviewing the study, they said that it contained affirmations and statements that were superficial, exaggerated, inexact, emotional, and false. But they did take some of it into account. And my guess is, and clearly they did, because the new general instruction of the Roman Missal corrected most, if not all, of those.
I love that the point that you made. Someone just posted about this on the Trad Recovery Forum about that quote of Archbishop Bugnini's. You mentioned that in the footnote, and you read the whole quote right down here. Could I just read that? First, I'll read what they say. He said, "We must strip from our Catholic prayers and from the Catholic liturgy everything which can be the shadow of a stumbling block for our separated brethren, that is, for the Protestants." But what he actually said was, "Scholars think to shed light on biblical and liturgical sources from which the new texts are derived or inspired, which the study groups of the concilium accomplished by using a chisel. And let's say that often the work proceeded with fear and trembling by sacrificing terms and concepts so dear and now part of the long family tradition. How not to regret that Mother Church, Holy Catholic and Apostolic, deigned to revoke the seventh prayer, and yet it is the love of souls and the desire to help in any way the road to union of the separated brethren by removing every stone that could even remotely constitute an obstacle or difficulty that has driven the Church to make even these painful sacrifices." And so you said those were Archbishop Bugnini's thoughts on the revisions of the Good Friday intentions and not on the entire revised missal. That was such an excellent point.
Yeah, and I actually wrote this before the writers at We're Peters and Michael Lofton made the exact same point later on. So it seems like that opinion's validated.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's starting to circulate more. So I'm so glad that you clued into that, because, again, we've got to really pinpoint these stock phrases and talking points that the SSPX and Sedevacantist just throw out. Like, even that quote of Pope Paul VI about the smoke of Satan. I've heard that quoted so many ways, with people just taking like the tiniest little bits of it and applying it in whatever context they see fit. But it's like, no, you got to remember like where and when that was written and what he was talking about. And it isn't just for anybody to take and make their little flag.
A lot of it is just misuse of context.
Right.
And it's the same kind of errors that you find in the Ottaviani Intervention. It makes a lot of statements that were taken out of context. It draws conclusions without building an argument to support them. It basically makes an argument, assumes it's true, and then goes on to discuss the consequences of that. It's almost, one of the things they teach you in school when writing an argument paper is chiefly that you have to support the argument you're trying to make. You can't just make an argument and then make a conclusion based on that. You have to support the argument. And that's one of the biggest problems with this intervention, is that almost none of the arguments that it makes are supported. The society made basically compared the two masses. They said that the traditional line mass focused on God and the sacrificial nature. It teaches that Jesus Christ through the priest offers his body and blood to the Father in atonement for the sins of humanity, and that communion is a consequence of the sacrifice and allows men to receive the fruits of the reparation. And they accuse the new mass of focusing too much on people. It diminishes the role of the priesthood. And it changes the definition of mass, reduces it really to just a meal, basically a symbol of the Last Supper. That removes elements of the sacrifice altogether. And they claim that this is demonstrated because the new Mass, whether officially approved or not, the widespread use of the vernacular, the versus populum, the removal of the tabernacle from the visual center of the church, the disuse of Gregorian chant, and reception of communion on the hand, and the much more wider use of lay Eucharistic ministers.
Yes, those are things that did kind of develop, but not necessarily for the reasons that the society is stating. Right. So then you kind of open up the Ottaviani Intervention, give bullet points of their 7 arguments, their charges against the new Mass, and then you end up answering all of those exactly.
So it's kind of a Summa Theologica kind of thing, where you basically restate the objection and then address it directly. I wanted to kind of keep that same flow to prove that each of these points were being addressed, because I really didn't want to leave anything out. I don't like responses to arguments that don't address the actual argument, because there's too much of that going on.
Yeah.
And I think that if you're going to address the argument, you have to address it directly, or as directly as you possibly can. Right. I think, and it requires really giving the benefit of the doubt, because I think that a lot of responses to arguments these days, there's not so much directly addressing the argument and a lot of trying to read into the intentions of the persons. Like, what are you really trying to say here? And then the response is really just to the assumed intent of the person and not to the actual argument they're trying to make. That's why a lot of these arguments don't really go anywhere. Because among the traditionalists, for example, a lot of them tend to try to read into some kind of malintent. And then they say, oh, you're just saying that because you want to divert attention away from what you're really trying to do. But rather, they don't really address the actual point itself. And that's kind of what I see in a lot of these arguments, especially on social media and in a lot of articles. And I think really the biggest offenders tend to be those papers like Catholic Family News or The Remnant or media outlets like those, the ones where they kind of take the words and then try to read a meaning into them that, when you read it in context, isn't really supported. And this was kind of the problem with the last subjects we talked about: ecumenism, religious liberty, and collegiality. You
do a really good job of pointing that out in your papers, and that is a really poor way to base an argument, because again, you have basically suspicious people on this side looking at the church and what the church is doing and saying, somehow finding fault with it, or being very worried about what it's doing and why. And so instead of just taking exactly what comes out of it word for word, like in an official capacity, and being like, officially I'm okay with this because the Holy Spirit is guiding the church and is not going to guide us into error and grave sin, and not worrying too much about people's agendas or whatever, because the Holy Spirit is bigger than that and he is taking care of things. But there seems to be this departure from like filial obedience and confidence to not like, you just have to swallow every little thing that comes your way. But if it's part of the actual magisterium of the church and the disciplinary decrees, like, since when have those ever been so faulty or dangerous as traditionalists would suggest? And then they try to attribute that to something. And they're examining the inner motives of people. They're picking up all this hearsay evidence, these anecdotal stories and things that we can't even really prove, most of them. But it sows these seeds of doubt in people's minds. And then it makes them in fear of what can happen to them. And what is the church trying to pull? Like, maybe she doesn't have my best interest in mind. Maybe I've got to take everything and examine it myself, because at the end of the day, I'm that's the only one that can ensure that things are really going to be okay. And that's never something that a true Catholic should be thinking or preaching to other people, because our Lord is in the seat of control. He is taking care of it.
That's probably the most frustrating thing about the traditionalist movement as a whole, because the idea of Catholicism is that we shouldn't have to worry about any of this. We have a magisterial, we have a teaching authority that is protected by the Holy Spirit from steering the ship of the church into heresy or a major or error. It is free from the stain of error, to use the words of the church fathers throughout multiple councils. And the problem, and one of the things that we are called to, one of the process of discernment is, does this bring you peace? And when you don't have that foundation of the visible church and you're relying entirely on an invisible church, I mean, that's not reliable. And you're always second guessing yourself. Am I doing this right? Because you have to depend on yourself, because tradition, whatever Archbishop Lefebvre might have said, tradition is not an authority principle. We can't turn to tradition with a capital T, because tradition doesn't teach itself, no more than the Bible does. And for Protestants, it's the Bible. For traditionalists, it's tradition, but it's the same problem. It doesn't teach itself, because inevitably we're going to encounter new situations. We're going to encounter new circumstances that require an additional explanation. And one of the things I'm noticing with traditionalists is that there's a lot of fragmentation. It's mirroring basically the Protestant churches, because once you rely on an authority principle that is really open to anyone's interpretation, you're going to have as many interpretations as there are people who teach them. And that creates a lot of stress, and it creates a lot of fear. Like, who has the right interpretation of tradition? Is it the society? Is it the SSPV? Is it the Most Holy Family Monastery? Is it all these groups that claim to have consulted with tradition and have the authentic interpretation?
Yeah.
Because now you've opened a can of worms, and you've unintentionally undermined not just the authority of the church today, but also the authority of the church in the past. Because you can't just rely on the church of the past to cast down on the church of the present, because where do you draw that line exactly? Is it 1960? Is it 1970? I know that there are sedevacantists who believe that the see has been vacant for over 1,000 years now. And
wow,
if you can't rely on the authority of the past, you can't use the authority of the past to cast down on the authority of the present, because it's the same authority. Because if the present church can get it wrong, then how do you know the church of the past didn't get it wrong too?
Yeah, right. Yeah. How do you know that the Catholic Church isn't somewhere else completely, and that you've been off the rails so long that your idea of what the Catholic faith is completely erroneous, and somebody else has it figured out, and you got to go sniff them out? Like, you could be so cold off the scent that there's no hope of ever finding it again. I mean, really.
Yeah, I think Pope Francis used the example of the old Catholic Church, the group that broke away after Vatican I, for the same accusation that the council was erring and breaking away from the true church. And they apparently do so many different things now that they're allowing that the current church doesn't still. And it's like, once you become an authority unto yourself, then it just basically becomes whatever you think tradition is teaching. And like I said, if you doubt the present authority, you can't use the past authority, because it's the same authority.
Right.
If you are claiming that a pope can err, then that doesn't excuse Pius XII or Pius X or Pius V from that, because they were the same level of authority. Who's to say they didn't err?
Right.
So you can't do it. The entire premise of traditionalism is entirely self-defeating.
That's a great point. It's like doctrinal and logical chaos, but I think what keeps it propped up is all the props, the externals, because they do things basically the same way. They usually pray out of the same missal. They wear the same clothes. They use the same, incense or the organ. And, they have all these things. They have churches that look like, a regular church, or at least at some point in history, that's how they present themselves. And so people are like, oh, that's like secure to them. And they feel confident. Like, I know what that is, because it looks like something I remember. It looks reliable. And so then they just sort of They buy in because it looks safer and more certain than other things that are going on in the church, or, you know, some of the, you know, the more recent developments or reforms. And so they just don't want to mess with it. So it's like, well, I'll just go over here with you. Like, one of the ladies I interviewed some months back, she's like, our criteria growing up was if the priest wears a cassock, says his prayers in Latin, and, you know, says the 1962 mass, then that's a real priest, and that's where you can go, and that's the church. So it didn't matter if he was sedevacantist or SSPX or whatever. It was just like, well, that's, you know, I'm a simple layperson. That's what I look for. That's how I know. But it's like, that's skin deep. There's so much more underneath the surface, and you can't make such an important decision of who you're going to follow and trust with your eternal salvation based on what they wear and what book they pray out of.
Yeah, it's odd. I don't remember the 1962 Missal being one of the marks of the church. I remember one. I remember Holy. I remember Catholic. I remember Apostolic. I don't remember Tridentine Missal being among those things.
Well, you must have missed it, Tony, because according to them, it's out there.
Yeah, I don't remember that. It's not even the same Missal as the 1945 one. And like, I remember Dr. Kwasniewski saying that the whole derailment actually started with St. Pius X and his revision of the breviary. So we got to go back to that. And you couldn't have a better example of the logical consequence of being traditionalist, because again, you have to keep moving the goalpost back and back and back and back, because then you're looking at that Missal, say at the time of Pius X, the breviary, for example.
Yeah.
And then you're noticing, well, these adjustments that were made prior, they kind of got things wrong too. So maybe we should go back to the Missal of Pius V as it was issued in quo primum. And then, okay, you get back to there, and then you start looking into the missals that existed before Pius V codified it. And then you can look at those missals like, wait, by codifying the 1570 Missal, Pius V got rid of this. I think that was a mistake, because this more clearly expresses sacrifice. We should go back to this one. It's a constantly shifting goalpost. Where is the line? That's why the liturgy and all of it, and let's not even get started on the Eastern Catholics. We're like, well, wait a minute. If it's a 1962 Missal, then we've been doing it wrong since, well, as long as the Latin rites existed. Let's not forget, we have 23 other Catholic churches here that have nothing to do with the Latin rite, have nothing to do with the 1962 Missal, and they've gotten along just fine without it since time immemorial, because they have their own liturgies.
Yeah.
So obviously the 1962 Missal can't be the mark of the true Catholic Church, because there are true Catholics in the East that don't even use the Latin rite. So again, it's another argument that completely falls apart when you stop to think about it for more than 5 seconds. The church is visible as well as invisible. I made this point on Michael Lofton's video the other day, and that, you know, the church is both visible and invisible. It always will be visible and invisible. Pius XI, the Mortalium Animus, took great pains to make that clear, that the church is not an invisible body of believers that exists without the visible hierarchy, because that's like saying that it basically is a reflection of the Arian heresy, which said that, I may have this backwards, but it doubted the divinity of Jesus. It said that Jesus was fully man but not God. Or is it the other way around? But anyway, it basically denying one nature of Christ in order to affirm the other one. And the church can't do that, because the church is in the image of her divine maker. And more than that, the church is the spouse of Christ. You can't pit natures against the other. It even says in Lumen Gentium that the church is both visible and invisible, just as God is visible and invisible.
Oh.
So that is what one means. It's not like there's a visible and invisible. It's not that there's a church of eternity and a church of now. I guess the term eternal means that it's still ongoing. It doesn't mean what they think it means.
Right.
But that would imply that it's still ongoing. And if it's still ongoing, then there is no modern church, because it's still the ongoing church. It's a word that means eternal. There is no past, present, or future. It's a misuse of words.
Right. And that was something that Lefebvre went in for, was the temporal Rome and eternal Rome, and making a distinction between them. And there was an encyclical that like blew that to bits. So, even before Vatican II, that was already an idea that was condemned. I think it was Pope Pius XII, but I don't remember which one it was.
11th, then it was Mortalium Animus.
It was that one?
Yeah.
Okay. That's the one.
Yeah.
Okay.
People should actually read that one, because I know the Most Holy Family Monastery likes citing it to prove, to kind of like go against ecumenism and collegiality. A, it doesn't say what they think it says, and B, it actually torpedoes their entire reason for being, because their whole existence is based on the fact that the church has gone underground and it only exists among like a few pure believers. I don't know what the Diamond Brothers like have in response to that, but I haven't heard a good response to that, namely that the church can't be solely invisible because it's visible and invisible. It's like saying that Jesus is fully man but not fully God.
Kind of a contest argue against things. They sidestep the questions and the points that they can't refute. So they use these circular kind of movements of, it's like, well, you can say that, but what about this? And they sort of just kind of keep it moving. And it's very tricky. And but yeah, because there are some rock hard things that they can't explain, or that do refute their position. So they just kind of have to ignore them, which is
that was my first indication that the traditionalist argument wasn't a very good one, because I noticed a lot of that wheel spinning and that whole shifting the goalposts and trying to bring up different points to kind of like, well, what about this? What about this? I know a lot of people like to say, well, what about the bishops in Germany? It's like, let them worry about the bishops in Germany. We're talking about this one.
It's like my kids when they get in trouble for something, and maybe I only catch the second offender in the act, and I'm like, what are you doing? And then they say, well, sister just did this, so I'm doing it too, or I did it to her because she did it to me. And it's like, well, I'm sorry to have to tell you again, but just because somebody else does something naughty or something to you doesn't mean that it gives you permission to be ill-behaved. Like, no, you can't use that as a reason. It doesn't hold water. And especially in the church, it's like, people are like, oh, the traditionalists are being so attacked and persecuted. And, what about all the terrible liberals that are doing, getting away with murder? What about them? They're making a lot more trouble. And it's like, no, we're not going to talk about them. We're talking about you and your problem, because it needs to be resolved. Yes, that does too. But it's not really your concern. This is the business at hand.
I mean, obviously, the Vatican has problems with them too. I mean, there have been interventions written. You just have to know where to look. Go find them. They're there. We can have conversations about different things. The church is perfectly capable of addressing multiple problems at the same time. So let them address that other problem in their own time. Right now, we're focused on this one. And there are problems with this one that you can't ignore because someone over there is doing something else that you don't like. The entire use of their entire position here, refuting the new missal to stick with the old one, is based on that whole kind of experimentation. The whole like, well, they're experimenting with the liturgy, so why not we do the experiment of tradition, to use Archbishop Lefebvre's phrase. And it's like, but hang on, didn't you just get finished decrying all the experimentation that was going on? Why are you suddenly proposing an experiment of your own?
Right.
And this whole thing is the intervention was basically essentially the whole rationale for that experiment. So you could probably sum it up by chapter. The first one was kind of an introduction. So there were 7 points. They claimed that the new Mass, it changed the definition of the Mass, it changed the presentation of the ends, it changed the essence, the elements, it disrupted liturgical unity, and it alienated the Eastern Orthodox. For the definition of the Mass, they again claimed that the emphasis was shifted to supper and memorial rather than on the representation of the sacrifice of Calvary. They claimed that it changed the definition into supper memorial rather than the representation of the sacrifice on Calvary. And right off the bat, we see that whole problem of additions, because the general instruction of the Roman Missal in its current edition, this is how the current general instruction of the Roman Missal defines the liturgy. And I'll say it word for word. At Mass, that is the Lord's Supper, the people of God is called together with a priest presiding and acting in the person of Christ to celebrate the memorial of the Lord, the Eucharistic sacrifice. For this reason, Christ's promise applies in an outstanding way to such a local gathering of the Holy Church, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in their midst. Matthew 18:20. For in the celebration of Mass, in which the sacrifice of the cross is perpetuated, Christ is really present in the very liturgical assembly gathered in his name, in the person of the minister, in his word, and indeed substantially and continuously under the Eucharistic species. So that's 2 mentions of sacrifice right there. And those phrases, and acting in the person of Christ, the Eucharistic sacrifice, in which the sacrifice of the cross was perpetuated, and substantially and continuously under the Eucharistic species. None of those phrases were in the edition of the liturgical instruction that the intervention cites. So you're not getting the whole picture right off the bat. And because you're not getting the whole picture, they're relying on a faulty premise to support everything that comes after in that chapter. I mean, we could end this discussion right here, but we're only just getting started.
Tony. Oh my gosh. Well, and then you go on to include in here that in the germ, the general instruction of the Roman Missal, now there are 38 mentions of the word sacrifice compared to 18 combined mentions of the words supper and meal. So it's like, well, more than 2 times the amount of mentions of sacrifice. That's definitely a very significant emphasis on that. That's never gone away. And so, yeah, it's just so telling. You go through then the Sacrosanctum Concilium and the germ and the popes, all the popes, you have mention of different things they've all said affirming these principles that the traditionalists claim are lacking in the Novus Ordo. And you're like, there's textual proof from everyone here that you can't even deny. Like, it's completely explicit that they are supporting this very traditional understanding of the Mass. But again, we're falling into this thing. I notice it's like the trads tend to quack about the new catechism and how it inverts the ends of marriage. But actually what it does is it mentions them in one breath, but it doesn't number them. It happens to mention one before the other, because when you have a sequence, you're going to say one thing before another thing. But it does nowhere say that it's now, we used to understand it this way, but now the church teaches that, procreation and education of children are now a secondary cause. It's not numbered, but in a way you can't separate the ends of marriage. They're all so bound up together. How do you even number them? And the church never numbered them before, that to my knowledge. It's like, yes, maybe it listed them in a certain order, but so now we're talking about this in the Mass: sacrifice, meal, union of love, and all these different terms. And it's like, it's all those things. How can we number them or quantify them? It's like we're not really qualified to do that. We're just acknowledging the realities of all that's happening, and it's all important. So why do we need to be threatened by some of the actions at Mass and not others, or consider that they're supplanting? It's like, it's just more. There's definitely this narrow mentality in Tradland where it's like they're afraid of more because it's like a threat to what they already had. And I don't understand where that comes from. Maybe you can comment on that. It's like more mysteries of the Rosary, more canonized saints, more options in the Missal, more possibilities for the laity to celebrate the divine office now that, was pretty much excluded from before. And they're just like, oh, no, we don't need that. All we need is a Rosary and the 1962, and we don't want all your extra.
I wanted to briefly touch on the ends of marriage, because it really is worth saying. I actually had a society priest make that argument to me, that the Vatican II flipped the ends of marriage around. And then I got around to reading Gaudium et Spes. Do you know what it says?
What does
it says? By their very nature, the institution of matrimony itself and conjugal love are ordained for the procreation and education of children, and find in them their ultimate crown. Thus, a man and a woman, who by their compact of conjugal love are no longer two but one flesh. Does that sound like they're diminishing the procreation and education of children in any way? They don't even put anything before that. They just go right for it.
That's great.
So, I mean, look it up. It's in Part 2, Chapter 1, Section 48.
The church never officially in her teachings and magisterium contradicts herself.
Mhm.
Not about doctrine, not about that. In disciplinary directives, she changes things from time to time for prudential reasons. But in doctrine, never contradiction. It's always the same. It's just if there's more that comes out later, it's development. It's just further illumination of something we already knew, and it's being expounded in a particular way, but it's not taking away from what we had. It's not changing anything. The church wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Or it wouldn't be the church if it did.
Yeah. And in response to your wonderment about like why people are so afraid of more options, are afraid of more, I think for them having just a set missal with one annual cycle of readings, super simple, it's almost like a certainty. They like certainty. I mean, we're kind of in a strange world where there's so much uncertainty that they kind of want everything to be predictable. They want certainty. They want something to rely on. And they think that a sign of the true church is something reliable and something you can depend on. So they kind of look at something that's fixed and unmoving as something they can rely on. The problem with that whole like emphasis on certainty and reason is it's almost the same thing that our secular world likes putting at the top. They like putting certainty at the top. They like having proof of something tangible that you can see and touch. They don't like, there is such a aversion to things that you can't prove, something that you can't touch. It's the whole aversion to, ironically enough, the aversion to faith. Because faith implies you're putting your trust in something that you can't see or have no reasonable way to put your trust in. But It's almost like a loss of faith, as it were, in the church's divinity and the divine certitude that the church will not err. And I think they just like that certainty. And what you were saying before about the externals, I mean, those externals are not problems in and of themselves. I like Gregorian chant as much as the next person, probably even more. I think if you were to ask me, I would say, yeah, I prefer Ad Orientem. I prefer Gregorian chant. I prefer a very reverent, very respectful liturgy, basically the same way that the Society, the Fraternity, and the others celebrate it. Like, whether it's the new Missal or the old, that's kind of pretty much how I prefer to celebrate it. I'm kind of indifferent when it comes to me personally. I'm kind of indifferent when it comes to female altar servers because it doesn't really touch on the singular nature of the priesthood. I think there was kind of a lot of elaborations that altar servers are not supposed to be a recruiting ground for priests, even though it can be a useful recruiting ground, but it's not primarily supposed to be associated with holy orders. And that was the rationale that St. John Paul II used in allowing bishops to decide whether or not to use women altar servers, because altar servers do not touch on holy orders. They were never supposed to. Mm-hmm. But even more than that, we can have the externals, but without that, but you can't rely on just externals. You can't rely on things because it's kind of the opposite problem, where we're kind of claiming that the church is supposedly an invisible group of believers, but you're relying on externals at the same time. So it's almost a contradiction. They're basing their faith on an invisible church, but that's entirely visible, but no invisible element to it.
Oh,
so
interesting.
It's very strange how that kind of came about. Because when you're making the marks of the church entirely visible, like a visible, like 1962 Missal, that priest is celebrating the traditional MS, that's where the Catholic Church is, but you're lacking that invisible divine certitude because that priest was not given the charism of infallibility.
Right.
So
like you're saying, a loss of faith, which I think is dead on. A loss of faith, it's like a substitute of security for faith. You're like, I want to be Catholic, I want to hold to the Catholic faith, but I want to hold to what I feel comfortable believing in, and I want visible external assurances that I'm on the right track. And if I don't have those, then I can't be confident that I'm in the right place and believing the right things. And so when you take those away from people, if their faith is so bound up in those things, or you can't guarantee that it's going to be the same every single time they go to mass, there might be, they might use Eucharistic prayer too instead of, the Roman canon. And if that's just going to throw you into a dither because you weren't expecting it and you couldn't count on it, it's a real manifestation of the quality of your faith and what it's based on. And is that what God wants you to base your faith on?
Yeah, and there's such a presumption that all the changes were because the previous ones were bad in some way, and that's not true. The Sacrosanctum Concilium never said that the previous Missal was bad. It just needed reform. And good things need reform every once in a while. Like a good statue, it gets worn down after a while. It needs to be rehoned, as it were, to make its original features more evident.
Right.
Or like it gathers dust. It gathers accretions, to use their term, that, need to be chipped away every once in a while to keep the actual thing completely visible. And you can look at the offertory that was changed. There's this presumption that because the offertory was changed, that means we're diminishing the sacrificial nature of the Mass. That's not true. We're changing the offertory to emphasize the Mass's connection to the Hebrew Passover. Dr. Edward Sri, in that biblical walk through the Mass, when he was talking about the offertory, he mentioned that the new offertories were phrased almost entirely like the Hebrew barukas, or blessings, that they made before meals. You have two of them that read almost exactly like the new offertory. The blessings for the bread and wine. For bread, it's a literal Hebrew translation to English would literally say, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." And then the blessing for wine, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine." The new barukas are almost identical to that, but look at what they add to each one. For the blessing of the bread, they add, "It will become for us the bread of life," which is a very clear reference to John 6, where Christ said, "Unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you will not have life within you. I am the bread of life." It is a reference to that whole discourse that Catholics rely on to justify the real presence. So in that one offertory, you have a reference to the Passover meal, which is a sacrificial meal, and you have a reference to John 6, which is where we derive our doctrines on the real presence in the universe from. So you have an affirmation of sacrifice and real presence all in one goal and all in one statement, and that's just the blessing of the bread. And
that's great.
The other one that adds to the blessing for wine, for the fruit of the vine and work of human hands, "It will become our spiritual drink," because Christ said, "For my body is true food, my blood is true drink." If there's any wondering about what spiritual drink refers to, crack open a Bible every once in a while and read John 6. It's right there. I don't know why the intervention is tossing and turning in bed wondering what spiritual drink refers to. You have the Bible. Open it. It's there. John 6. Read the entire thing. Talking about it.
Yeah. You make that point in the paper about the term spirit and spiritual, that it's referring to being food for our souls, not that the presence of God in the Eucharist is only spiritual or in a sense, and not like the physical transubstantiation. Like that objection is just wiped out by reading these actual documents, because they reaffirm over and over that doctrine is still in place, that transubstantiation happens, that we're talking about Jesus being truly present. But it's like, we don't need to affirm the real presence every time we turn around in very specific terms in order to substantiate the fact that we believe in it. That would be exhausting and unnecessary.
Yeah, and that's probably one of the reasons that they removed some of the prayers in there. They removed, like, for example, the prayer to the Trinity, which they claimed is clearly proof that the new Missal is downplaying the doctrine on the Trinity. And I'm like, well, that's interesting, because the very first words of the new Missal are in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Clearly it's not refuting anything, because you still have I know it's a reduction, but a reduction does not mean contradiction. They assume that reduction means teaching the opposite. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't follow.
Yeah. It's also possible to scrupulously duplicate things without necessity, and shouldn't those things be removed at some point to not hinder people's, devotion and access to, what's being offered in the liturgy, because it's just so like burdened down with all these things, these gestures, these prayers, these repetitions. It's like, how much is enough? And yeah, right. Are we doing it because we're worried that we need to do more, because maybe it's not sticking this time? Maybe God didn't hear me that time. Maybe I'm not impressing on the faithful enough about this. And it's like, okay, well.
It turns it into a kind of Neo-Pelagian experiment in terms of like, I need to do more to impress God, because my works will get me to heaven. That's where the term Pelagian comes from. Oh. So you turn the Mass almost into a Neo-Pelagian exercise in which you're thinking, oh, I got to add more prayers in here because I need to make my sacrifice more pleasing. And I mean, we're Catholics. We don't think that everything is a vain repetition, but at the same time, it can get in the way if we're duplicating a bunch of things that we don't need to. The prayers at the foot of the altar, for example, they were not originally part of the Mass. The original beginning of the Mass was the introit, which is still a feature of the new Missal. The prayers at the foot of the altar were originally prayers that the priest said to himself in private before Mass ever got started. The reason that they became a part of the Missal was because St. Pius V wanted every priest saying it. So it just became a part of the Mass, and it was during a time when lay participation in the Mass was not very involved. So it was like, well, what's the difference? No, not a lot of people are fully participating in this liturgy anyway. So like private prayers, it just found its way in there as an essential part of the Mass. But back when the rubrics were essentially written for the priest and for the server at the same time, the new Missal was kind of the first time that it was written with both the priest and the laity in mind. Because in the previous Missal, you did not have instructions for the faithful to kneel here, to stand here, to sit there. They do not exist in the previous Missal. It was kind of left up to various places. So even among society churches, there's no consistency in that. In one church, for example, people would kneel at the Sanctus Sanctus, but in another one, they'll kneel after it, which will sometimes create the awkward situation where people kneel and then 3 seconds later, the priest who is saying the canon already deep into it, is already elevating the host.
And I also want to add, because you were talking about those offertory prayers, and it reminded me of a friend of mine from the society who was saying, well, what about the argument that I've been told that those prayers, those barukas, were taken from the Talmud, and that's a satanic book because of the blasphemy it contains and stuff. And I'm like, okay, that Talmud is a collection of many, oral traditions of the Jewish people. The fact that something is in there doesn't mean that it's participating in blasphemy. Okay. It doesn't mean it's forever tainted. Like, the devil quoted scripture to our Lord. And that doesn't mean that the scriptures he quoted or the entirety of Holy Writ is forever contaminated because it was in the mouth of the devil. It's like, I mean, that again, I'm like, those are probably blessings that Jesus himself used, because they date back far enough. They were probably in common usage at his time still, and that he was probably using himself and possibly even used at the Last Supper.
It's almost a certainty that he used them at the Last Supper. I mean, originally that's where the model of the Mass came from, even though it's not pointed toward the Last Supper in and of itself. It is pointed to the sacrifice, but the Last Supper is an essential part of that sacrifice because that's when it began. I think Dr. Scott Hahn made this argument in his book, The Fourth Cup, I believe it is. And he talks about how he links the saying of Christ, I thirst, on the cross with the other 3 cups that came beforehand that were part of the Last Supper. And the fourth cup, that was part of that Passover meal was not taken until the sacrifice on the cross later. So that whole thing kind of forms that one single act of worship.
That's so cool. It's just, it really pays to go back. And I love those biblical scholars and the work that they're doing to bring that to life for us today, because there's so much significance behind everything that we do. And, and to many points of the reform, what it added, what it brought back, that we've forgotten about. And that it's like, wow, it actually does bring us closer to our roots. And even Quo Primum wanted that to happen. It wanted to restore us to the, how did it say that? I don't remember the exact wording.
Yeah, it basically said that it wanted to restore the right as it was in the early church. So that was already a goal that Trent started, and Pius X built on with the start of the liturgical reform and culminated in Vatican II. It was kind of a work that, it's not like this liturgical reform came out of nowhere. It was in the works for almost 500 years.
Yeah, right. Like if they had known everything we know now at the time of the Council of Trent, then they would have been implementing these reforms then, most likely, instead of, because that was their objective, was to bring it in line as much as possible with the worship of the early Christians. And now we can do that even better. So why would the church frown on that or say, no, sorry, the 1962 or the Tridentine Missal is codified dogmatically forever and it can never be changed. So if we made a mistake and we didn't put everything in there that should have been, oh, well, we have the ultimate now.
Oops.
Oops.
Yeah, a lot of them like to use Quo Primum as like the super dogmatic document. And the problem with that is that Quo Primum is an apostolic constitution that was promulgated. It constitutes an act of the ordinary magisterium. It's not an extraordinary act. It's not an ex cathedra dogmatic statement. It is an apostolic constitution that Pope St. Pius V used to promulgate the Tridentine Missal.
Yeah.
And even in there, he made exceptions for missals that have been older for more than 200 years. So it's not like the Tridentine Missal is supposed to replace everything. And as I implied earlier, it only touched on the Latin Rite. It did not touch on the Eastern churches. So
yeah, there's nothing dogmatic in that constitution. It's purely disciplinary.
Yeah.
So yeah, it can definitely be changed. Just see Pastor Aeternus from Vatican I. It's completely within the Pope's right and ability to be able to change that. So, I guess that's maybe why the society gives a nod to the fact that they consider the Novus Ordo valid, but it's just so problematic that they think that their judgment of the problems within the Novus Ordo allows them to dispense people from a precept of the church, that it just can automatically overturn that. And I've never seen where they can even give proof that could ever be possible, let alone by some small group of people without the authority or permission of the Pope to just make that kind of decision and start dishing it out to the laity.
I think they make way too much of Quo Primum. And it ends with, like, whoever modifies this missal will, to paraphrase, whoever modifies or change or tries to make any changes to this decree or this missal will incur the wrath of Almighty God. I think they read that to say, like, if you change this missal at all, you'll make God angry. But if I might propose a probably more accurate reading, it's basically investing that missal with the authority of the church. If you go against the authority of the church to promulgate this missal and regulate it, you'll go against the wrath of Almighty God. You'll incur the wrath of Almighty God. And so, yeah, that's where the problem is. It's not changing the missal in and of itself. It's changing the missal against the wishes of the church. So going against the wishes of the church is going to incur the wrath of Almighty God. So I would be very careful about saying who's incurring the wrath of Almighty God here, because there's only one group that's going against the wishes of the church, and it ain't the Vatican itself.
I have to say, this was interesting to me, that the session 22, I think, of the Council of Trent, I think that's where I was reading it, because I kind of went and looked up some more of these things after I was reading your paper. And it commands frequent explanations of the Mass by the pastor, like the liturgy and, throughout the liturgy and, at sermon time and stuff, of making it very open and illuminated to the faithful so they understand what's going on and why, because they wanted to be very careful that even though the Mass was to be said in Latin, that nothing was to be lost on the people as a result. And I'm like, well, how well was that being respected and carried out? Obviously not well. That command of the Council of Trent, because people were very clueless by and large and not getting very much out of their experience of Mass because they didn't get what was going on. And I don't think there was probably nearly enough or frequent enough catechesis on all these points. Just one way to show that the church pre-Vatican II was not doing everything right, and that it's like, you know, if you give an instruction and it's just not feasible, it's sort of like a disciplinary directive to your kids. You're like, okay, I want you to do this. And then if you just see them falling over and over and over, or forgetting over and over and over, at some point, you know, you could just keep like trying to spank it into them, or you could be like, you know, maybe that's not really working for the church right now. Maybe that's really not working for my kids and my family. And I'm going to kind of adjust, and I'm going to say, okay, scrap that. How about we do it this way and see if that is a lot more of a, you know, an effective result that we get. And maybe it's just like the missing piece. You know, we don't get everything right on a human level right out of the gate. And this is, again, liturgy and, you know, the things surrounding the essential nature of the sacraments. Those are disciplinary. They can change. And sometimes they need to change.
Yeah. I mean, we have to make it, my wife and I, we have to make adjustments in our discipline all the time. And it's like, you know, listen to me, you need to stop, you need to take your dishes to the sink. And then 3 days later, my kids are taking their dishes to the sink and playing around with the water. And it's like, I'll give you credit. I guess you are listening to me, but for the record, you don't have to do it that hard. So it sounds like contradictory advice, but in reality, it's just an adjustment later on that still adheres to the spirit of what we're trying to accomplish. It's like, yes, take your dishes to the sink, but don't chuck them in there and like waste the water. It's like, who would have thought I would be telling my kids to like not do something I kind of want them to do, but it's like, you know, it's not contradictory advice. It's just different advice that's geared toward the same end.
Right.
And I mean, regarding discipline, I know that they will point to the Council of Trent as like enshrining the language of Latin as if like no other exceptions were ever made, but I can point to several exceptions that were made. The Latin Missal was translated to Syriac in the 1500s. It was translated to Chinese in the 1600s, Arabic also in the 1600s, Gregorian and Georgian and Armenian in the 1600s, and in the 1800s you had Mohawk and Algonquian, I hope I pronounced that right, translations in Canada, and Hindi in 1958. So already you have the Missal being translated into various languages. And what do all those languages have in common? They do not have a Latin root. This is different from the Romantic languages like Spanish and French and these other languages that have Latin roots in them. So they're kind of discernible back when Latin was the vernacular, and it was the vernacular at some point. The whole reason it was changed from Greek to Latin was to keep the Mass in the vernacular. Right. But more than that, even people with no exposure to Latin can kind of like follow the Latin language because there are certain words that you can pick up on. But for someone who's like native Chinese or Native American languages, whose language has never had any connection to Latin whatsoever, it's not going to make sense at all. So that's why you had Saints Cyril and Methodius bring a translation of the Missal in the Slavic language so that the people they gave it to would understand the liturgy. So there's what they were trying to accomplish at Trent was not to say that only Latin must ever be used. It was trying to say that we need to protect Latin because it is a sacred language, and people are saying it's not a sacred language. But no one's disputing that now. Right. It's like, okay, Latin is a sacred language and must always have pride of place in the liturgy. It's the primary language of the Latin Rite. That being said, we can allow the vernacular so long as we accept the fact that Latin is still the primary language of the Latin Missal.
I was looking for that great thing you had about the vernacular back here, and what you said about by contrast using the author's logic. One could level the incorrect accusation that by insisting on Latin in cultures with languages that have no connection to the Latin language, the Tridentine Missal is bound to European culture and sensibilities, implicitly denying the universal character of the Church.
Yeah, again, it's the same kind of fallacious logic that they don't realize they're opening themselves to basically the counter argument that has the same logic turned on its head. Right. And that was toward the to the objection that the new mass by its adaptive and flexible nature destroys the unity of the rite. And we kind of unintentionally addressed all of that just now, especially in regards to the Latin language.
Right.
And I guess the only other point I would make to that particular point is that, when you go to World Youth Day, have you ever been to World Youth Day?
I have not, but I've always wanted to go, and my sisters have been 2 different times, and it was just great. So, yeah.
I went in 2011 to the one in Spain. That was Pope Benedict XVI's last one. And I was really struck by how, like, so many people with so many different languages could all attend one event. And even leading up to that, I went to masses that were in Italian and Latin at the Vatican. And then we went to France. I went to a mass that was in French. And then in Spain, we went to one that was said in Spanish. And I was struck, like, even though these are all languages that I don't really know all that well, I can still follow it perfectly because it's the mass. And it's like, even though it's like different languages, it's all one mass. It's almost like a symphony orchestra. You have the oboes in one section, you have the trumpets in another, bassoons over there, violins, violas over there, drums in the back, and each of them completely different instruments. But when you put them all together and you have a conductor kind of waving a baton around, you get beautiful music. Yeah. I mean, imagine for a second if every single one of those instruments were just trumpets. You get people plugging their ears like this the entire time, or saxophones. It's easy in music to make the saxophones, but
well, before I even had ever encountered the Latin Mass, and before we even knew about traditionalism, my mom would always tell me, the Mass is a wonderful prayer, and anywhere you go in the world, you'll be able to participate, and you'll know what's going on, even if it's in a different language. You'll still be able to follow because the structure is the same. And 99% of the world, or the Roman Rite world, is saying the Novus Ordo, and the structure is the same. Maybe they are using a prayer for various needs or something, in place of the collect of the day, or a different Eucharistic prayer or something. But it's like, that doesn't throw you. You still know what's going on. You know what
the
part
rhythm
of
is still
you're at.
Yeah.
So
I don't really get this whole like destruction of unity at all. I don't get that because, and it wouldn't make sense anyway, because the unity of the Rite is not based on the language it's using. It's based on the single act of the church. It's based on what happens at the Mass. It's the same sacrifice for all time. Right. It has nothing to do with whatever language happens to be using at the time.
Right. And if it were based on the language, it would have to be in Aramaic still, because that's how it was instituted, right?
Yeah. And again, you have all the Eastern Catholic churches who are part of the Catholic Church. So again, you can't use Latin as the unity principle, because even before the new Mass, we had the Eastern churches not using Latin. So what? Are they not unified to us in the sacrifice of the Mass? Again, it's an argument that I'm sure that it made sense to Delarier when he wrote this, but it doesn't really hold up when you think about it and you think to all the different ways it doesn't make sense. And that's basically this intervention in a nutshell. It makes sense the first time you read it, but then when you stop to think about it, and even without doing research, if you stop to think about it long enough, you were like, well, no, that actually doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But I think they're just so eager to knock the new Mass that they don't stop to think about like all the different ways this points you wrong. You're encouraged to basically go right into attacking the new Mass. You're not meant to take this intervention in and think about it. You're meant to just immediately attack the new Mass.
Right.
That's the problem with this intervention.
Right. Well, it's a handful of people who had concerns and presented them, but obviously the minority, because it wasn't all, half the bishops of the world signing a petition saying we're concerned that, for instance, removing the Latin language from perpetual and exclusive use in the liturgy is going to threaten the universality and unity of the church. Because most of the bishops in the clergy involved in the concilium were not concerned that was going to really affect it in a substantial way. And it just took time to prove that out, because you and I are products of, for future generations after the council that got to experience how universal and, what true prayer of the Mass is, no matter what language it's in, no matter how much of it you understand with your ears. And the fact is that more people now understand more of the Mass than before when it was in Latin, and most of us didn't use Latin, didn't know it, So unless someone was standing there explaining it, or you're reading your missal, then you were just not going to be sure about it. So now it's, it's definitely more of an open book to people, and it's very much accessible. What's not universal or unifying about that? It's our prayer. It's our, the prayer of the people of God. So the more we can enter into it, then the better we're praying and the better we're building up the body of Christ.
Yeah. And I can speak to that in two ways. The first is that you have much more participation than you used to. It's common to like notice the Catholics that leave right after communion is done.
Yeah.
We've all seen that, right? Well, that is actually a holdover from before the new Mass was promulgated, because prior to the new Missal being promulgated, from everyone I've heard talked about the Mass before the Second Vatican Council, my grandparents, for example, Mass was kind of seen as something where you just go to receive the Eucharist and then you go home. You do your quiet prayers in the background while the priest is doing the Mass, and then that's why they have bells, to let people know, hey, guess what? Consecration's happening. If you had a missal, you wouldn't need the bells because you would know that that's what's happening. The whole reason they put bells in to begin with was to call the people's attention to it who wouldn't otherwise be paying attention. They'd be praying the rosary or maybe doing their own private devotion.
Right. Well, like most of the world isn't literate, so they can't use missals. So what are they going to do?
Yeah.
Just sit there and wonder.
Dr. actually said this as a positive about the previous missal, was the fact that some days, like, I can follow along. He said, basically, in an interview with the Catholic Gentleman, he said, on some days I want to follow the missal, but other days I want to just put it down and say my own prayers. Like, and you're presenting not participating in the Mass as a good thing. That is not what the Church wants. Ever. It's not even what Pius V wanted. It's not even what St. Pius X wanted. You've had this ongoing trend toward more conscious and active participation because that is what the Church expressly wanted. It's all over Sacrosanctum Concilium, because we are not supposed to be sitting in the back doing our own thing.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I highlighted your this excerpt from your long quote from Sacrosanctum Concilium, where it says, "It is not enough to be mere observers. The Church desires that the faithful render full conscious and active participation in the liturgy. It is their right and duty by reason of their baptism that they should be instructed by God's word, be nourished at the table of the Lord's body, render thanks to God, and to join with the priest in offering themselves through Christ the mediator. Therefore, in revising the liturgy, the full and active participation by all the people is to be the primary aim."
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, that was a problem, or it wouldn't be made such a big deal of in the document that, started the reform of the liturgy, that all the bishops but 4 in the entire world signed.
Yeah.
Right?
12 theologians against 2,000 plus bishops.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The biggest council the Church had ever seen, with the most universal attendance ever, that had never even been possible before. It was the best representation of the Catholic Church in one place there had ever been in history.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest, the Trads find the most fault with that. And it's like, well, I'm sorry, but that's an ignorant thing to do.
Mm-hmm. They would probably be the first to say that the Church doesn't care about your feelings. They're right. It doesn't. They don't care. It doesn't care about yours either, oddly enough. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, If you're going to say that, the Church doesn't care about your feelings when you're talking to liberals, then it obviously doesn't care about your feelings when it comes to traditionalists either. I mean, like I said in the last one, I know that a lot of people were really hurt by Traditionis Custodes. It's a very painful pill for a lot of people to swallow. And I think a good argument can be made that it was probably heavy-handed. I think Michael Lofton made that argument. And it's like, okay, that's a perfectly fine argument. And I might be inclined to agree, if only for the sake of my family, my in-laws. But you can't at the same time say the Church doesn't care about your feelings and then bemoan the fact that the Church is attacking your feelings by taking away, the 1962 Missal. It's like, well, which is it? Does the Church care about your feelings or not? And that's probably why a lot of them have not really gotten on board with Pope Francis at all, because it seems evident that they don't really understand the idea of being a pastoral church. What they see is that the church doesn't care about your feelings, and obviously the church cares about people's feelings. That's why Summorum Pontificum was even promulgated to begin with, because it wanted to give people a chance, because Pope Benedict wanted to give people a chance to prove that we could be traditional, like follow the traditional liturgy and still be faithful to the church. I mean, and Pope Francis in Traditionis Custodes noted that, in the intervening 12 years or so, that has not happened. And it's actually gotten a lot worse. Even before he promulgated Traditionis Custodes, there was a lot of criticism about his pastoral. And I think, Summorum Pontificum was in and of itself a pastoral accommodation. So
Right.
you can't criticize pastoral accommodations and then get all angry when that gets turned on you. And it's like, okay, well, if you don't care about pastoral accommodations, then you obviously won't mind if we take this away from you, because you're clearly not appreciating what we're doing for you. Even back in 2012, when Pope Benedict XVI was still the Pope, Archbishop de Noia, in his letter to the Society, told them, like, hey, just so you know, we are still seeing a lot of problems. We lifted the excommunications. We allowed priests to say the traditional Latin Mass without needing to get permission for it. We are still seeing an attitude of bad attitudes from your corner, and it may not be long before we have to start addressing this. Well, the Vatican waited 9 years. They finally addressed it. So I don't think we should look at Traditionis Custodes in a vacuum, because this was a culmination of 12 years or so of knocking Vatican II, knocking the revised liturgy, and the whole idea was to kind of facilitate the society's recommunion with the church. That has not happened either, and that was all under Pope Benedict.
Right. I mean, it's not, if you will, it's not the way the church was going, because after the Reformed Missal came out, and even right before, and Pope Paul VI was giving addresses, kind of preparing the church for it and explaining it, he was not going to keep allowing the previous Missal to be used except by aged and infirm priests, so that they didn't have to suffer the hardship of having to learn a whole new Missal, or of not being able to say the Mass to which they were so accustomed. That was the only concession. Otherwise, it was going away. It was going away. And so then we have all this upheaval with the Traditionalists and Lefebvre, and then Pope John Paul II forms the Ecclesia Dei Commission to, under which the FSSP and these other institutes were started to. It's like, okay, well, we will work with you, because this is obviously a big deal for this small, tiny group of people in the Roman Rite. It's like, okay, it is like, but every one of those people matters to the church. So the church is kind of like, okay, well, we will just allow this for a while and we'll make exceptions for you. And so she did. And then Summorum Pontificum came out, and that was a way bigger deal. And it's like, well, we'll try this. Maybe this will help with unity and, satisfaction within the life of the laity. And it's like, we were still having all these nitpickers and all these problems that are coming up in this division. And it's like, I just did an interview with John Coleman from the Accommodations Institute. And in that interview, it came up, he's like, I understand exactly what you're saying, because the same week that Summorum Pontificum came out, the bloggers, the Catholic bloggers and the tradies everywhere went from saying, we just want to be free to worship the way we want, the traditional way. We just want to be able to do the traditional Mass and be left alone. And as soon as they had that, they started going, now it's time to get rid of the Novus Ordo. We got to get rid of it. We got to do away with all these things, because, that's not really all they wanted. That wasn't their full plan. And it's like, they may say, this is all I want, but then they get that and they prove that it's not enough. Just like the society, they wanted the Latin Mass to be freed, and when it wasn't, it's like, oh well, now you have to retract these errors from Vatican II, or we won't come back into the church. And it's like,
I think the society has gotten so used to misinterpreting the church's intentions and reading too much into it that they kind of took that concession from Pope Benedict XVI and took it entirely the wrong way. They took it as like a concession that the society was right and the church was wrong. They did not take it as the pastoral accommodation that it was. So they kind of took it as like, oh, well, clearly it's going in our direction, so let's push for these things now. Let's push for those things now. And they didn't get it. They just didn't get it. And that's
almost
the most
like
frustrating
the
thing
church is
about
showing
this.
yourself to be an indulgent or a permissive parent now, so maybe we can get away with a little bit more. And it's like, wait, but you were just criticizing the church for being permissive and not smacking down on the liberals as hard as you want them to. So it's like, I mean, it's just like them crying out against ecumenism, but they're benefiting from it because the church is being patient with them and is reaching out to them and is trying to, affirm what's good and their desires, not just give them the smackdown. But so it's like, you guys are still around and you're still not like totally getting the thumbs down because of that, because the church is always trying to bring you back in and to meet you where you're at. And so, that it doesn't make sense to kick and scream against that.
Yeah. They complain about the pastoral nature of Pope Francis and then wonder why the church is not being pastoral to him. It's like, it would have helped. It's like, but you don't understand the pastoral nature of the church. And that's the problem. It's really hard for people who do not understand the pastoral dimension of the church to get this. And that's probably why Summorum Pontificum ultimately failed. Because there's a lot about the pastoral nature of the church that has a lot of uncertainty necessarily built into it. Because parents, when they're trying to parent their kids and trying to find ways to make them into good adults, sometimes you have to try different things with them that don't necessarily make sense all the time. I mean, in the Bible, did everything God tell the Israelites to do make perfect sense? Like, put this snake on this bronze pole, and that will take away things. It's like, okay, that doesn't make sense to me, but I'll try it. And it wasn't the bronze pole in and of itself that cured the Israelites. It was their faith. It was their obedience. By doing what God told them to do, that's what cured them. It wasn't the bronze serpent in and of itself. Right. It was their obedience and faith that got them that. It's patience. I mean, you don't break from the doctrine. You don't break from dogma, but sometimes you need creative ways to kind of like help people grow in their understanding of those doctrines and dogmas. So what seems confusing to people who have been part of the church for so long and know better probably makes perfect sense to people who don't understand the church at all. Right. So, and who are trying to work their way back into the church. I mean, how do you help them get there? Do you like sometimes it takes different ways to do it. Sometimes a firm hand, sometimes a gentle hand, but it's all aimed with the goal of getting them back in the church.
Right.
Hence the whole removing any barrier that could represent a disruption to communion.
Right. Right. The church isn't acting like it knows everything, or it's like everything we've done is always right. And it's like willing to try something else or to change something and give it a chance. The church is humble. And so, it's or it's even like Pope John Paul II asking forgiveness for, this group of people or for that thing, or even in that document that you have a quotation in here from where he's talking about the Eucharist and the abuses and the misapplication of the council. And he asks for forgiveness for all the scandal and the upset that rightly caused. And that, please forgive all the members of the church who have not done as they should have done. And that, for all the damage that did. And it's like, he always wants to try to make it better. He's willing to admit that sometimes on a human level, the church went wrong. And like, it wasn't supposed to. The directives themselves, the rubrics were fine. Like, the will of the church is good and right. But then there's human error, and then there's people that take advantage of it. And he's willing to acknowledge that and to ask forgiveness for that. And I think that's so humble. But I've heard him criticized for that. Like, oh, it's so weak. How dare he apologize to the Jewish people for the way that the church had misunderstood or mistreated them or whatever. The Jews are terrible. And it's like, well, I'm sorry, but your view is a little too narrow. And you're not thinking like a father who's trying to parent the entire world, whether people are Catholic or not. They're his children too. Or, ideally would be. And he's going to treat them like his children anyway. He's going to extend that to everyone. We don't have this Jew-Gentile thing anymore, where we have to, ostracize people and treat them differently. That's not the Christian way. If it were, it wouldn't win people like it always has.
The whole full conscious active participation in the Mass was itself a pastoral move to try to get people to participate in liturgy and get more spiritually nourished. That's why they don't make a distinction between, well, if you arrive before the offertory, you're okay, but if you arrive after, you're not okay. It's like, no, we want people to be here for the entire thing. And we're still trying to train that out people, because you still see people leaving before Mass is over, and you still see people arriving late through no fault of their own. I'm sure that, you know, people have families or vehicle problems and stuff, but still, I mean, overall, I think people are still trying to warm up to the idea that, you know, this is for me. This is a spiritual gift that the more I participate in, the more benefit I'm going to get from it.
Right. Yeah, the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist, they form two halves of a whole. And yeah, it's right in Sacrosanctum Concilium that the laity are meant to be present for both. So yeah, maybe technically you can fulfill your obligation for Sunday Mass by showing up for the offertory, but that's not really the vision of the church, and it's not going to do the most good for your soul. So again, are we living as our faith about checking boxes and meeting our quota for, you know, good works, or is it for doing what, you know, what we should in the fullest sense of the word, and, you know, what the church is telling us this would be the best for you, and as a loving, you know, pastor, this is.
I suppose I could meet my workout regimen too if I did 2 sit-ups a day.
Yeah, right.
I kind of view Pope Francis almost like a coach. He like tends to like drive people to like do stuff. I feel like John Paul II was a great leader. Benedict was a great teacher, and Francis, I think, is a great coach, because he's not like as like theologically precise, but boy does he like driving people and getting them down onto the margins and be like, go, go, go. That's probably why traditionalists feel like the most like rebuke from him, because they're the ones who should be doing it better than anybody. And it's like, go, do it, do it, do it. And I think that whole like emphasis on faithful probably is what led them to believe that the new Mass reduces the role of the priest to a mere presider. It's like, well, yeah, it talked a lot about the faithful, but again, it's assuming that all the emphasis on the faithful means taking away from the priest. It's not a zero-sum game where if you add one, you take away from another. That's not how it works.
Yes.
I mean, and it doesn't make sense to begin with, because, well, I can still pick out the priest when I go to Mass, you know, and there was a hysterical like prediction that it would be a matter of time before the faithful joined in the consecration formula and consecrated along with the priests. I'm sure that there have been abuses to that effect, but I have never seen it myself, and it seems like a slippery slope argument that has not come to fruition.
No.
That has not come to fruition in over the 50 years since the study was published. So
yeah, definitely not in any official capacity. And the church has reaffirmed, you know, many times that only a man can be ordained a priest, and that, you know, only a priest can confect the Eucharist and do all these things. It's like there's always a very distinct line. If you don't think that's the case, you're not looking hard enough. I mean, you're not looking at all, really, because yeah, it's pretty plain language. That one's not too hard to refute. Again, yeah, it's. I know there was a move for a while where the priest would like sit down in the pews with the congregation instead of having their own chair in the sanctuary, because, you know, they didn't want to be so set apart that the people felt like they couldn't relate to them or something. And it's like, I get why they were doing that, but I think it was misguided. But that I have not seen for a long, long time. And I don't think that was ever a widespread practice. It was just, again, people kind of trying like, oh, well, maybe we need to do this, or priests not wearing their clericals so much because it sets me too much apart. And that was an individual move. That was nothing that the church ever encouraged or mandated.
Again, they tend to point to a lot of isolated examples to like prove the whole, and you can't really do that. That's not logically consistent.
Right.
The fact that it tends to happen is not evidence of itself, but the Missal itself is flawed. I mean, if that were true, then what do you make of all the priests who were before Vatican II, like doing those 15-minute masses where their Latin was awful, where they left out whole parts of it because they wanted to get their obligation over with? I mean, Well, I think since we've covered
belief in the real presence. Did we talk about this? Kind of a little bit.
No, and I think we should. Yeah, the idea that through reduction of like certain signs that it implicitly repudiates belief in the real presence through the suppression or reduction of various signs, gestures, and prayers. Again, reduction does not equal repudiation. It is not the same thing. And I don't know how else I can say that. It is not the same thing. Because the stuff that still affirms the belief in the real presence is all still in there. It's in the general instruction of the Missal. It's in the rubrics themselves.
If eliminating certain gestures or repetitions is considered as undermining the value of the Eucharist that we're reverencing, then I think you have a very kind of Pharisaical, quantitative understanding of what makes prayer good or worthy or sincere.
Yeah, kind of like we were saying before, it makes the Mass a Neo-Pelagian exercise where if I don't do it enough, it's not going to be clear enough.
Right.
It's not the repetitions. This is what Protestants think when they think that Catholics have a problem with vain repetitions. They usually talk about it in regards to the rosary, but it's not vain if it's directed, if it has a purpose for it. The rosary, the reason why we have 10 Hail Marys is not because we're reciting 10 Hail Marys into themselves, but because reciting the 10 Hail Marys is the time we need to reflect on the mystery that we're reflecting on while we're praying it.
Right.
So,
well, and then the rosary came about because it was sort of like the psalter of the laity, because the laity couldn't easily pray the divine office. And so instead of praying the psalms themselves, they were praying a Hail Mary for each one of the psalms in the psalter. And so that's what the 15 decades has, enough Hail Marys for each one of the psalms. And so that's gotten a little bit lost. It's like, well, now we're in a day and age where that, you kind of have both options, but it's like something for everybody. It's just more. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Like you're saying that too.
Yeah. I mean, the rosary at the end of the day is a private devotion. It's not the public prayer of the church. So it's like, it's not something that's dogmatically enshrined, and you can like pray the rosary or even a different devotion altogether. It's like, it's not certain exterior gestures that make you Catholic. It's not, if I repeat something enough, it makes it Catholic. No, it's really like ultimately what makes the sacrament valid is you're basically doing a valid sacrament licitly with the intention of doing what the church wants. By uniting yourself to the church, that is where the Mass becomes really the Mass, because you're doing it the way the church wants you to do it,
right,
together with them.
Right.
That is what makes it that way. And it's not the rubrics themselves. It's not the repetitions in and of themselves. It's the meaning that they still have, celebrated in concert with the rest of the church.
What about this one from the Intervention about the new Mass purporting to draw from the riches of Eastern liturgies, but ends up in doing so sacrificing its unique Roman character and bringing it more in line with Protestant rather than Eastern liturgies? What do you say to that, Tony?
Again, it's just a slippery slope argument, and they don't really explain why. It's alienating the East. It's one of the more confusing points that the Intervention makes, because they don't explain it. They just predict that it's going to sacrifice its unique Roman character and bring it in line with Protestant liturgies. Well, again, that has not happened. I mean, even Protestants will look at the New Mass and say, that is sacrificing Christ over and over again. Protestants still make this argument. They haven't given up that argument that we're basically bleeding out Christ over and over and over again every week.
Right.
That has not stopped. They clearly see the new Missal for what it is.
Right.
Even if they're getting it wrong about why we're doing it. They may get a theology wrong, but they still recognize it as uniquely Catholic.
Right. I think this is another one of those points that time tells that it's really not a concern, because decades have gone by and it's still, very obvious to everyone that the Catholic Mass is the Catholic Mass, and it's the same in its essence as it ever was. Nobody's confused about that. And especially not when it's done as it should be.
And I know there was another allegation made that the new Mass in its changes, compromises, or obscured like the ends of the Mass, like the alternate ordinary imminent purposes, and we've already basically addressed most of those already. But I mean, I can briefly touch on the ultimate and ordinary ends. The ultimate end is the sacrifice of praise rendered to the Most Holy Trinity. And again, that kind of went back to what we were saying, that apparently the adjustments reduce the Holy Trinity. No, because like I said, the whole Mass starts off with the prayer to the Trinity. And as far as the ordinary end as a propitiatory sacrifice, all those references are still there. You find it in the Confiteor, the act of contrition, the references to the remission of sins and prayers in all the Eucharistic prayers, and the request for God's mercy throughout. And there was a claim that the economy of salvation is lost by the suppression of part of the offertory, that God like restored mankind. Is like, well, why don't you read Eucharistic Prayer 4 at some point? Because that whole canon is based on the economy of salvation. I mean, it basically, and it says, and I quote, "And when through disobedience he had lost your friendship, you did not abandon him to the domain of death. For you came in mercy to the aid of all, so that those who seek you might find you. Time and again you offered them covenants, and through the prophets taught them to look forward to salvation. And you so love the world, Father, most holy, that in the fullness of time you sent your only begotten Son to be our Savior. Made incarnate by the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary, he shared our human nature in all things but sin. And to accomplish your plan, he gave himself up to death, and rising from the dead, he destroyed death and restored life." So, again, that's the economy of salvation right there. It's still in there. All of these things are still in there.
Right.
You just need to actually look for them.
Yeah, you need to pick up these books and read them for yourself. Don't listen to somebody propagandizing you about, their interpretation or what they heard from, it's like a game of telephone. A lot of times when I talk to trads, it's like they've heard from this person who heard from this person who heard from this website who heard from this other website or whatever. It's like, seriously, it's like when you ask, did you actually like read that thing that you're quoting from, or like, it's so many things, especially when it comes to Pope Francis, anything that he said or wrote. And usually, almost always, the answer is no. It's like, well, what did you even hear? Why are you getting upset about it? Because you don't, not like we're just saying people are making stuff up all the time, because I know people are sincere and they're trying to tell the truth, but they get confused. Everything has a context. Yeah. And again, a point kind of tying into the whole Orthodox facet is, isn't one of the Eucharistic prayers even taken from, or it's taken from a source that it's very similar to the anaphora, of the Orthodox or Eastern Rite liturgies. So it's actually like bringing in that patrimony.
In fact, I can state for the record exactly where it came from. I mean, the Roman canon is based obviously on the Roman canon. Eucharistic Prayer 2 is based on the apostolic tradition of Hippolytus. The third one is based on the 4th century anaphora of St. Basil. And Eucharistic Prayer 4 is based on the apostolic constitutions of Antioch and St. Basil's Byzantine liturgy.
Well, that's cool. I mean, again, I'm just like, I think it's the Eucharistic Prayer 1, the Roman canon, is beautiful, and I'm always glad to hear it. But whenever I hear the other ones, it's like, especially 3 and 4, because those are the longer ones. They're more different. And like the whole story of salvation, it's poetic, it's beautiful, it's inspiring. It's like, I'm glad that we can have some diversity within the liturgy and not changing the substance, the words of consecration, everything, but it's supposed to make it more rich and for there to be more to meditate on and more to bind us together, not to cause division. Yeah.
And it does. I mean, all of these Eucharistic prayers, especially 1, 3, and 4, they approach the sacrifice of the Mass from almost like different angles and spotting different parts of it that maybe the canon itself by itself doesn't fully cover. I don't know that the canon completely explores the economy of salvation the way Eucharistic Prayer 4 does. But again, it's all a complementary kind of thing. It's not a zero sum where one detracts from another. They all join together to form a symphony, basically.
Yes, I think that's a really good analogy.
Mm-hmm.
What about the objection that the new Mass does away with many of the defenses against error built into the traditional rite?
Well, if that was true, then it begs the question. If the Mass had so many defenses built into it, then how do you explain the fact that over 2,000 Catholic bishops, the church as a whole clearly saw room for improvement? And it's not like the Tridentine Mass in and of itself did away with Protestantism. They're still here.
Right.
And all those defenses, again, are still there. In the offertory, the revised offertory, like I said, the reference to John 6. I mean,
yeah,
that forms kind of the core of our faith in the real presence.
You could argue the same way by saying every dogma of the church should be iterated in every liturgy of the church so that it reinforces the fact that we believe these things. And if that isn't done, then it means that somehow the church is waning in her faithfulness to doctrine. Like, so every Mass, we'd have to explicitly mention and affirm the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption of Our Lady and, all the natures of Christ and all the things that were defined. And, we'd have to go on and on and on and on every single time, or we'd be omitting something that was essential and thereby failing. And it's kind of like that whole the Pope, the Council, the Mass book has a whole chapter on that that saying the law of prayer, is the law of belief, lex orandi, lex credendi. Like, people tout that like some kind of absolute dictum. And you have this quote in here too, Pope Pius XII in Mediator Dei, talking about the liturgy. He says the liturgy does not decide and determine independently and of itself what is of Catholic faith. Like, it's a prayer, it's an authentic expression of our Catholic faith, but it's not like a walking catechism necessarily. I mean, of course it is, in as much as it does contain, but it's not exhaustive and complete. It can't be in an hour.
We have feast days that expound on a lot of stuff, like the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. We do have that. But yeah, if you're going to use the Mass to explain every piece of Catholic doctrine, you better sit down, because you're going to be there for a long time. But Pope Pius XII was trying to say there is that the Mass is not primarily the primary source of catechesis. It does have a lot of catechetical value in it, because through its expression we affirm truths about our faith, but it's not a complete all-exhaustive thing. And again, if you start viewing the Mass as something that's supposed to defend all the errors of the world, we're going to get back into a neo-Pelagian exercise where, did I defend against this faith in here? Did I defend against that error in here? Did I defend against that error? Oh, I didn't do it adequately enough there. I got to add a little more in here to defend against that error.
Right.
Nowhere in Quo Primum does it say that we restructure the Mass to address every single error that the Protestants do. It was certainly designed to reaffirm the real presence, but it was not supposed to be a bulwark against Protestantism. What they were trying to do was to codify the Missal, so there would be one expression in the Latin Rite, and they wanted to bring it to its more authentic early expression. It was never designed specifically to repudiate Protestantism and every single error known to man. Because again, if you tried to do that, you'd still be here.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking this. I don't know if it's a good analogy, but the Mass is the wedding feast of the Lamb. And you think about, like, when a couple gets married and they go through this very specific liturgy, and we pronounce our vows and the blessings and all these things. And it's like those are all done officially at the beginning, and to, set the tone and the reality of the whole marriage. But then every time throughout your marriage after that, every time that you do something that communicates grace to your spouse, or every time you renew the covenant of your marriage by, conjugal relations, you're not obligated by the church to first renew your wedding vows, or to pronounce this certain formula, or to go through all these points of, like to read the section in the Baltimore Catechism about what is the sacrament of marriage. Okay. It's something that it's spontaneous. It's it's an act of love. It's a consummation that it reflects the life of the Trinity. It's like, and that is the primary means of communicating grace to your spouse. Okay, just like the Mass is the primary means of communicating grace to our souls. It's the apex of worship and liturgy in the church. And so that is an expression all of its own, and it's totally tied into love and, you know, adoration and all these things. So whatever that encompasses is beautiful and perfect. It doesn't have to be like a recital of every, you know, iota of Catholic teaching. Like we have the creed in there on Sundays and solemnities, so we do get that. But yeah,
I mean, the Mass certainly contains the whole truth, but doesn't have to explain the whole thing every single time.
Right.
And if you look at the new Mass long enough, you'll find a lot of like little nuggets of stuff in there too that you can pull out. The only reason the traditional Latin Mass seems to be more exhaustive is because we've had it for much longer than the new Missal. We need to sit down with the new Missal and extract some of these nuggets because they are there. I mean, the part about the Baruchas, I don't feel like a lot of people realize that about the new offertory. But the more you think about it, the more you realize, wow, there's actually something to all this. And even the other Eucharistic prayers, if you spend time with them long enough and prayerfully reflect on them, you will see things in there that there was nothing wrong with the previous Missal. There was nothing wrong with it in and of itself. It just needed to be reformed. It's building on a tree. There's nothing wrong with it as a seed. It just, if you want it to grow into a tree, you got to water it a little bit. You got to prune it every once in a while. Otherwise, it's going to die very quickly.
That's great. Right. Or be stunted. Yeah. Right. It has to have the proper care or it will be thwarted in the growth it should have had.
Yeah. I mean, like a lot of traditionalists make a huge show about like preserving tradition. And like, well, what's so great about preservation? I mean, it locks it away and it sterilizes it. And even though it may still look the same, it's all wilted and dried out. I mean, what they call preservation, I call starving to death. Even what we're doing right now is slowly growing and developing until the culmination of the world, which implies that that reform is a part of tradition. I mean, reform is in of itself traditional.
Oh, that's awesome, Tony.
I know there's 2 Thessalonians 2:15, which says hold fast to the teachings that were given to you. But it's not in the sense of where we just hang on to the letter of that teaching, although it's part of it, but it's not the whole thing. It's like we hold to that rock of our salvation. We hold to that tree of our deposit of faith, which grows and develops. Right. We have to hold to that source. And I mean, it develops, it enriches over time, but we still have to hold on to it. Even if it's reformed or pruned or refined every once in a while, it's still the same thing. We have to stick with it. I think we're ready for the conclusion, actually. I think we've addressed all 7 points. I'm looking back through this, and I can't think of one that I didn't address. And I mean, I know I made a huge show about how being direct in my argument responses, and this conversation was almost anything but. I was anything but I think if you want the more succinct version of this argument, I mean, that's what the paper is for, really.
Right. Yeah. Go read the paper. That's what we're making this video, because we want people to read the paper and to see all the great things that are outlined in it in a very like methodical manner, but all these wonderful excerpts from pertinent documents and quotations from the popes, and like it's all in there, and it's all like, you know, even the most pertinent passages are highlighted. They're like, you know, made bold, so they're easy to pick out. But yeah, it's not a waste of time. Go read it, educate yourself, because it's in there and you need to know where to find it.
I'll conclude with really this thought. We all hate liturgical abuses. We all do. People who respect the liturgy hate abuses. We all do. It doesn't matter what the abuse is. It doesn't matter who's doing it. Abuses are awful. I mean, I love the new Mass. I hate abuses. I think making a stink about abuses is a waste of time in this intervention, because nobody likes them anyway. At least the church doesn't like them. The problem is, I mean, a lot of people look at the traditional Latin Mass and say, well, this is just the same Mass it's always been. Why is it suddenly not a good thing? Or why is it suddenly not a good thing? I'll tell you why it's suddenly not a good thing. It can be. The rubrics in and of themselves are not a bad thing. But there's a reason why a sacrament requires more than validity to it. It requires laicity, which means you have to, and again, doing it together with the church. It becomes a bad thing when you're no longer doing it with the church, which is in and of itself a liturgical abuse. When you're basically using it to stand apart from the church, that is what makes the old missal bad. It's not the old missal itself. It's what you do with it that makes it bad. So, in an answer to that question, why is the traditional mass suddenly banned or something, or why is it suddenly not a good thing? That's why it's suddenly not a good thing. Not because of it itself, but the way it's celebrated. Because it's usually celebrated apart from the church, in practice, if not in spirit. Because I know that the fraternities still celebrates the traditional Latin Mass in communion with the church, and a great credit to them for that. But again, everyone is wondering why it's suddenly not a good thing. It's I'll tell you why it's not a good thing, because the church saw renewal that needed to happen. It made that renewal, and a lot of people are still not getting onto it. It's great watching my kid grow up. When they reach the age of 8, it's a great thing to see them at 8.
Yeah.
But if it's 5 years later and they're still 8 years old, suddenly 8 years old is not a good thing. It's a bad thing because it means they're not aging. Not only that, you're not only holding to an old form that needed renewal, but you're also using it as a flag to go against Catholic ecclesiology and weaponize it as a flag of resistance. And we can look at the Bible. What is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? The gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? The Mass or the church that makes the Mass sacred?
Yeah. That quotation you just used, that's from Matthew, right? Matthew 23.
Yeah, 17:19. Go look it up. I feel like a lot of traditionalists have lost sight of that warning from Christ because they're making the Mass an end unto itself. I mean, all of that's bad enough. Don't get me wrong, all of that's bad enough. But then the society goes on to say that they claim that the new Mass is an offense to God, their words, that Catholics are not obliged to attend it, and it should be avoided because the new Missal supposedly does not profess the Catholic faith as clearly as the old one does, and it consequently may promote heresy. I mean, it's classic waffling, but it's probably the most dangerous spiritual advice that anyone could ever offer. Especially, not just because the advice itself is bad, but the fact that it comes from people presenting themselves to be Catholic.
Yes.
Like true Catholics.
Right.
And the problems are manifold. One, because you basically have to say that the church promulgated a rite that offends God, and that the church is binding the faithful to something that is offensive to God. Because of that, if you're saying that the church can bind the faithful to something offensive to God, it makes the church, God's guarantee of divine assistance, meaningless. Because if the gates of hell are never going to prevail against the church, that's also from Matthew, then that naturally implies that the church will never bind its faithful to something offensive to God.
Yeah.
So you are basically calling God a liar. And a more blasphemous thing I cannot think of.
Right.
And you sow a lot of doubt into the faithful that make them wonder, well, if God's not with its church, where do I go? You're stressing out about that, and the society basically sets themselves up as like the last vestige of the true church, but they don't have any of the marks that identify the church. They're not one, because they've been breaking apart ever since 1975 when they left to begin with. You have the SSPV, you have like priests who are leaving following Bishop Williamson into the resistance of the resistance. And you have all these independent priests and stuff getting sacraments from all these independent bishops. I mean, you just see it in the way traditionalists argue with each other, whether you're a Septicantist, St. Pervationist. None of them can really agree what tradition is. So they're not one. They're not holy because they're not celebrating in communion with the church. So that divine certitude that is part of our Catholic faith can't extend because they're refusing that. They're not Catholic because they are rejecting parts of the magisterium, namely the Second Vatican Council and the New Mass. So to be Catholic, you basically either take the whole or you don't take it at all. They would be the first to say that. You either believe it or you don't. Well, if you're not going to accept Catholic ecclesiology, the Pope's authority to bind the faithful on liturgical discipline, then you are denying a central tenet of the Catholic faith.
Yeah, the primacy of the Pope.
Yeah,
they'll go on all day that they don't deny his infallibility, that he is the Pope, but it's like, yeah, but then you, by not choosing to obey him, you're denying him the primacy over you.
Yeah, I'd love to try that with my parents. Like, I still call you my mom and dad, but I'm not going to do anything you tell me to do. I'm pretty sure the fourth commandment, to honor thy father and mother, means a lot more than simply saying your mother and father are your mother and father. Finally, they're not apostolic because their governance does not consist of bishops in communion with the Pope. That's apostolic tradition, is that the church will always have a visible hierarchy composed of bishops in communion with Peter and his successors. So
right.
They don't have any of those marks. They try to claim that they have them, but they don't.
Right.
Because the charism of infallibility does not apply to Father Pagliarini. It doesn't apply to Archbishop Lefebvre. Because neither of them were the Pope. You have one quote from Pope Gregory XVI, who said, "The church is the pillar and foundation of truth, all of which truth is taught by the Holy Spirit. Should the church be able to order, yield to, or permit those things which tend toward the destruction of souls and the disgrace and detriment of the sacrament instituted by Christ? Those proponents of new ideas who are eager to foster true piety in the people should consider that, with the frequency of the sacraments diminished or entirely eliminated, religion slowly languishes and finally perishes." So by reducing themselves to only like a small corner of the church, they are actively denying people access to the sacraments by telling them they can't go to the new Mass. That's what makes it so spiritually dangerous. They are denying people the sacrament, the real presence of Christ. They are denying people the real presence by making them so afraid of committing error that they won't go. And that's a huge problem. And they try to get around that by saying, like, well, we believe the new Mass is valid. Well, which is it? Either you think the new Mass is valid, in which case there's no reason at all to tell people not to go there, or it's invalid, in which case you're right back up with what I said earlier, that you're basically claiming that the Pope can bind people to something offensive to God, and that makes God a liar. So you can't have it both ways. And then the final quote from Cardinal Ottaviani, remember him? Ottaviani?
Yeah.
The beauty of the church is equally resplendent in the variety of the liturgical rites which enrich her divine cult when they are legitimate and conform to the faith. Precisely the legitimacy of their origin, so basically the fact that they come from the church herself, the Pope and the bishops in communion with him, the legitimacy of their origin protects and guards them against the infiltration of errors. The purity and unity of the faith in this manner also upheld by the supreme magisterium of the Pope through the liturgical laws. So there you go. Cardinal Ottaviani is going against what the society is suggesting, that the new Mass has been infiltrated by errors. Imagine that. Cardinal Ottaviani is disagreeing with the SSPX. Think about that. And that's why I feel like the Ottaviani Intervention is a terrible title for this intervention, because, like, okay, what does Ottaviani really say about you? It's kind of disingenuous to use his name for basically your primary material for your reasons for doing everything you're doing, when he himself is telling you that doing this is a bad idea, and that the claim that the new Missal can be infested with errors is impossible. It can't happen because of the legitimacy of their origin.
What a reassuring thing. I mean, it just reminds us that we don't need to worry about all of these things. Like you said earlier, we're worrying about things that a Catholic was never meant to have to be concerned about, because being Catholic make sure that you don't have to be in charge and you don't have to be judging everything and holding your breath that, maybe this is okay, or maybe I haven't looked carefully enough for error and I could go to hell if I'm not careful enough. It's like, it's such a Pharisaical, scrupulous, white knuckling kind of Catholicism. It's like not what God ever intended, I don't believe, when he founded the church.
It's probably not that surprising to see scrupulosity so prevalent among traditionalists because of all the things that they're making people afraid of. If you don't have a rock to sit on, I mean, that's where all the ambiguity and uncertainty comes from. We might want to take a second look at who is responsible for all that ambiguity in the church. And if you want a hint, it ain't the Pope. I think I made this point on a Matt Fradd video a little while ago about his claims that he was being gaslit by the Pope's supporters because the Pope's supporters were supposedly claiming that nothing was wrong, that everything was fine. I don't believe everything is fine because the church is in a perpetual state of crisis because she's in the world and she's marching toward the culmination of the world. She will inevitably be attacked throughout history, and that's to be expected. Just the whole gaslighting thing really irks me because it isn't the Pope's supporters and defenders who are gaslighting people. It's the Pope's attackers. They are gaslighting the Catholic faithful as a whole into not trusting Holy Mother Church. I don't get why when people defend the Pope against the charge of heresy, it's gaslighting. But when people are saying we should go Septicantis, it's a solution, if not the correct one. We have a rock that we are able to cling to because we are Catholic. When you sow doubt into that, you are cutting people off from their foundation, and they don't have that foundation anymore. When you cut a flower from its roots, it's only a matter of time before it withers and dies. And they are all these people who are bashing the Pope and bashing Vatican II and bashing the New Mass. They are basically taking a hatchet to our roots, to the church, to our connection to the church. And if that is not a threat to the church, I have no idea what is. I mean, smoke of Satan indeed. That's where the division is coming from. If Infiltration by Taylor Marshall was about that, he would be a lot more credible.
There's a lot of decoys being thrown up. And I think it's what's really at the bottom of this? What's the most insidious threat? And, what's some of the proof of this is that people who leave traditionalist groups often, it's usually kids who were raised in them when they grow up. Most of them don't stay. And when they leave for nothing. Most of them. They become pagan or atheist, or because the society and these other groups, they're we're the truth. And we're the only place where you can find, the legitimate Catholic Church. And if you can't stand being here, or you become so disillusioned that you have to leave, there's nowhere to go. So then you literally have nothing. It ruins you on any other possibilities, and it ruins you on the real church, so that you can't go find your salvation in it.
That's what dependence on externals will do. I mean, the externals of piety are really good at presenting an appearance of holiness. But the problem is that when you depend on the externals, you are basically doing the same thing that liturgical experimenters did in the 70s and 80s, where they were trying to make the Mass more visually appealing, albeit in a completely different way. But the problem is the Mass is not there to edify you. It is not there to make you feel good. It is there to give you what you spiritually need. It's not supposed to make you feel good necessarily on a superficial level, with chants and incense and stuff like that. It's there to give you real food and real drink. And if you don't know what that reference is toward, because it's ambiguous, read John 6.
It's the worship due to God that the church is allowed to dictate. The church is allowed to dictate the form of worship. That is God speaking to you. It's through what the church codifies as appropriate for worship today. And if you are going to thumb your nose at that and say the church is wrong, I know a better way to worship God, then who are we really worshiping? Ourselves. God decides how he's going to be worshiped. And right now, God is speaking through his church saying, I want to be worshipped in the Novus Ordo, primarily. Like, yeah, I can be worshipped in the 1962, right? But this is the direction the whole church is going in the Roman Rite. And if you're not ready to get on board with that, or at least to be okay with other people doing that and calling it legitimate, then yeah, what have you done? What have you made your God and your idol that is causing you to break with the church?
It's actually a form of modernism. If you read Pascendi Dominici Regus, one of the marks of modernism, it's the philosophy of the modernist, is that we make ourselves, is immanentism. We make ourselves the center of like the origin of religion rather than God, who is the center of it. And that's the problem with shifting the authority principle from God to something abstract like tradition or the Bible, because those aren't authority principles in and of themselves. You have to trace it back somewhere. And if you can't trace it back to the church, you have to trace it back to yourself, because there's only two interpretations going on, the church's or yours. Modernism shifts it to yourself, because it's only through the church that we get to God. Outside the church, there is no salvation. I know that line loves getting parroted around, but outside the church, if you're not going to trace tradition back to the church and then back to God, you have nowhere else to turn except back to yourself. And that is the kind of modernism that Pope St. Pius X was warning about when he wrote Pascendi Dominici Regus. So in a kind of cruel irony, I don't know how many like traditionalists out there see the utterly cruel irony of believing that they are defending tradition. They probably really believe that they are, but I don't think they realize that because they've adopted all of traditionalism as their authority principle, I don't realize that they have become the very thing that they swore to be against. I think a lot of them have become modernists without even realizing it.
Well, like, how often is it that the faults that we perceive around us we perceive them because they exist within ourselves, so we can recognize them?
I tend to hold people to too high a standard and then really rail into them when they fail to live up to that standard. I mean, I think of that because I expect it of myself too, and I consistently fail at that all the time. I don't really like criticizing people because basically half of my family is traditionalists. Yeah. So then I say, like, you know, the fact is not lost on me that I'm still trying to be a good Catholic. I'm not very good at it, but I think the key is just to try to be a good Catholic, to do the best you can to try.
Right.
We have to orient ourselves to there, and it's only through God's grace that anything good comes of it. I mean, that line from Star Wars, do or do not, there is no try, it's a good line, and it has applications in certain contexts, but when it comes to faith, that's a lie. With faith, all you can do is try, because we can't achieve our ultimate end in this lifetime. So faith is nothing but trying. We will not come close to bridging the gap between us and God by ourselves. It will never happen. That's why we rely on God's grace. It's through God's grace that we are redeemed. It isn't through celebrating the liturgy perfectly. It's not reciting, it's not adding a bunch of prayers to sufficiently affirm the doctrine of the Trinity. It's not in all the times we make the signs of the cross throughout the liturgy. It's through trying to have faith. Because faith is not something we can do ourselves. It necessarily means trying, in a way.
That's awesome, Tony. I think that's a great thought to close on. And you shared so much that's wonderful. And yeah, that I need to go back and think about more. And yeah, very humbly too. I mean, you're not putting yourself forward as an authority. You're just saying, I'm a guy who's done some reading and I've thought through these things and I put it together to share with anyone who might benefit from it. And I think that's wonderful. So thank you for taking so much time to do that with us today.
You're very welcome.